speak.
That's perfect. Thanks, Jeff. As you know, this program, as Jeff said, is co-sponsored by the No Webster House, West Hartford Historical Society, and the Jewish Historical Society of Greater Hartford. If you don't know me, I'm the director of the Jewish Historical Society. And I'd like to thank the No Webster House for hosting us here. We knew that this was a story that is really a West Hartford story, a Connecticut story, and kind of starts off with a Jewish story, so we thought it made sense to combine our forces in that way. We'll be learning tonight about how 100 years ago, in 1924, West Hartford became the first town in Connecticut to institute residential zoning, springing from a controversy over allowing a Jewish man to open a grocery store on Farmington Avenue, in this picture that you may recognize if it's familiar to you. Then we'll bring the discussion about the impact of this history of zoning into the present, hearing about the efforts of the Open Communities Alliance to address the inequalities that have resulted both in West Hartford and across the state. Our first speaker will be Jack Dougherty, who is Professor of Educational Studies at Trinity College. He's the author of On the Line, How Schooling, Housing, and Civil Rights Shaped Hartford and Its Suburbs, a book in progress which you can explore at ontheline.trincol.edu. Got that right? As well as of numerous articles and chapters related to school desegregation, urban and suburban history, and school choice policies. He holds a PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Our second speaker will be Victoria Asfalg. She is a policy and data analyst at the Open Communities Alliance, which is based in Hartford. She's a lifelong resident of Connecticut and has a Bachelor of Arts in Urban Studies from Trinity College, and not coincidentally, she worked with Jack when she was a student there. We'll have plenty of time for questions afterwards, so please think about what you'd like to ask. And we also have some refreshments in the room right behind us there for afterwards. And if you need the restrooms, they're also right immediately behind you. So without further ado, Jack.
Thank you. Hey everyone, thanks for coming out tonight. I'm Jack Dougherty. I'm going to walk you through a few excerpts from that On the Line book that Beth mentioned. The overall goal of the book is I'm very much trying to make visible those hidden boundary lines that often were created to divide different people in metropolitan Hartford over time, and trying to highlight the stories of maybe activists, families, people who are crossing over boundaries, redrawing, or trying to erase some of those lines over time. This is very much a book in progress that I've been writing with student co-authors. Book in progress is a very polite term to say, I'm still not done, and some people are still waiting for it to be finished, but it's historical narrative, but has digital maps and video integrated into the book, and that's possible because it's a digital-first project. In other words, the entire book, chapters, everything I've got written so far with all the maps and everything, it's free to read at ontheline.trincol.edu. I'll even take us there in a few minutes to show you some of the principles and photographs and themes from the book. Chapter 2, which I'm not focusing on tonight, tells more of a story of overt racial housing segregation in places like West Hartford. Explicit ways that government policies, not just individuals, but state, local, or federal government policies were restricting who could live here by race. What I will be focusing on tonight is the chapter afterwards, all about excluding through zoning lines. Zoning lines don't overtly mention race, but they operate in very interesting ways that parallel with race by restricting who can live where based on how much they could afford to rent or to purchase a home. So we'll go there in a minute. And I'm trying to remind everyone here that this is, we'll see if this phrase works with anyone. It's the 100th Zoneversary. A little nervous laughter there because it's something people don't really celebrate in West Hartford. This is actually a chapter of our history that I think we need to know more about. I was surprised. Beth pointed out to me, she said, there actually is a panel talking about planning and zoning in the very back corner as part of this display here. You can see it if you look behind you, but it very much tells a story of a success of West Hartford and having successful suburban development. Success is very much in the eye of the beholder. And I'll be emphasizing tonight that we need to look at how zoning policies were created in Connecticut. West Hartford's an interesting example because it is the first municipality to enact zoning 100 years ago. And we'll be focusing very much on looking at a story of what I'll call exclusionary zoning to understand how that all happens there. So that's the story I'll be telling tonight, and I'll be talking for about 15 minutes or so, and then Victoria will take off with the present day. I promise to take you right into the On the Line book. Let's go there. And as I said, this On the Line book here, think about for the next few minutes here, I will be reading you a story from a book, but I'll be just emphasizing the pictures and some main themes, okay? So think of the relaxing feeling when people read stories 2 years ago. Chapter 2, which we're just briefly touching upon here, is, remember I said, many ways that there has been overt racial housing segregation in West Hartford and other places that people don't always know about. So I have other chapters, other presentations about federal lending and redlining. You may have seen images like these before. They've been more popular over time. These are the federal government's redlining maps for what is West Hartford, Hartford, and East Hartford. And the short version of this is that federal government was actually not just looking at the property, but looking at the people who lived there and recommending what types of mortgage risks were there. And that affected who could get types of loans, especially Federal Housing Administration loans, to purchase a home, say in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and so forth. Also, another part of the book, co-authored with several people, but Tracy Wilson, who's well known here, Restricting with Racial Covenants. Tracy and students and I found the race-restrictive covenants in places like West Hartford that people didn't know about until we found them 10 years ago. Here's an example. Not far from here is the High Ledge Home subdivision, and written into the deeds of those homes in 1940 was a statement making very clear that no persons of any race except the white race shall use or occupy any building on any lot except that, this is the exception, domestic servants of a different race employed by someone were allowed there. So if you notice here in West Hartford, there were only a handful, maybe I think we found maybe 6 or 7 housing developments that had that type of restriction. But my colleagues in other parts of Connecticut have found, I think so far we have, looking in other parts of Connecticut, we have found, where's the number here? 1,700 properties so far that have race-restrictive covenants in different towns in Connecticut, and we're encouraging people to help us find more of these because there's a legal process now that makes it much easier to renounce those as another form of overt racial segregation that unfortunately is illegal. Also, West Hartford, it's important to be aware that we have had many barriers in public housing that restricted who could go there and who could live there. During World War II, West Hartford had federal funds to construct wartime housing, and much of that was torn down. But while it was still there, explicit headlines and political maneuvering to keep African American wartime workers from moving into white-only public housing here in West Hartford is part of the story. Now, I mentioned I'm just going to touch upon those, but it's important to have that background of these overt government policies, could have been local, could have been state, could have been federal, but overt policies that were restricting who was going to move here by race is a good backdrop to understanding about zoning laws. Now, I'm going to mention here a couple phrases tonight. When I talk about zoning, in general, zoning is just decisions about how land is going to be used. And there are progressive purposes for zoning. For example, you may choose as a local government to not allow an industrial factory to be next to a daycare center or a school. So there are all sorts of reasons why people zone and make land use decisions. But what I'm focusing on tonight is what people nowadays refer to as exclusionary zoning, a phrase that wasn't used at the time, but this is a label that many of us use today. And that means the policies for zoning were often to favor more expensive single-family home construction by requiring large amounts of land per family and doing things that would make it cost prohibitive to have more affordable multifamily housing, duplexes, triplexes, or apartment buildings in similar areas. So this is the concept of exclusionary zoning, and notice, race is not explicitly used here, but certainly can have tremendous consequences for the racial and economic segregation of an area because exclusionary zoning can use money to restrict who could afford to move there. So let's jump into this here. And the best way to jump there, I think, is the origins of what happened 100 years ago, not far from here. Raise your hand if you've been inside this store years ago. Kingswood Markets, it's familiar to some of you. Great. I moved here about 25 years ago, and I lived right around the corner. Would occasionally go over and buy something take my kids there, buy some milk, buy some bread or something like this. And I was surprised when I read more into the history of zoning of Connecticut that this was the focal point 100 years earlier for what set off in a tremendous battle that brought zoning into Connecticut by and large. So what's the story here? The story goes back to the family of Jacob Goldberg. Remember the Goldberg name here. Jacob Goldberg and his family members were in Hartford, and they ran a Jewish grocery store, and they wanted to expand their business. So back in the 1920s, they looked west. That's where they saw the population moving. They said, let's build a second store, and let's put it on Farmington Avenue, and let's go get a respected architect. Let's draw plans. Let's put it in a space there. We've got land we could buy and put it in. And at the time, right on Farmington Avenue near Ardmore, a 1923 map of housing would show you that it's very different than what we see now today. In 1923, this is where Kingswood Market is in the blue, and this is the State Armory next door, which was the State Armory at the time rather than a retail plaza. But behind you can see what is now houses. These were just streets that were laid out where real estate developers and the town were hoping people would come and build homes. Okay, so Jacob Goldberg and the family got together. They had the land, they had the respected architect, they had followed all the rules. And when they were filing their building application permit to be given permission to build their store, the building inspector said no. Residents of the town were upset that someone was going to be building a grocery store in their neighborhood. And there's a little bit more going on there than just what that seems to be. If we look more closely at what's going on, Goldberg had followed all the paperwork, filed all the permits and everything like this. But Goldberg was certainly convinced that what was going on here was a case of someone pointing out to him. He was not just a grocer, he was a grocer from Hartford. He was a Jewish grocer. And he was moving into an area that maybe wasn't as favorable of having Jews in that particular neighborhood at the time. In fact, maybe they weren't happy about having anything that had a sort of an urban influence at the time. Is the story of this conflict over Kingswood Market is a story of anti-Semitism, or is it anti-urbanism? It's a little bit of both of those mixed together, as many conflicts really tend to be multi-layered. So I think it's important to remember that as many people are coming out and they're convincing the building inspector not to give Goldberg a permit, what's going on at the same time is this is a very intense period of anti-immigration sentiment and anti-Semitism in the United States. Those of you who studied your history, especially in the Hartford area, about 30% of Hartford residents in 1920 were foreign-born immigrants. About 10% of the Hartford residents were Jewish immigrants, often from Poland or parts of that we think of today as Poland and Russia. When we look back at that time, we have a tremendous fear among many West Hartford residents and others of anarchists, of Russian Revolution coming into their area in the 1920s. We have fears of too many foreign-born residents who need to be Americanized. The governor launches an Americanization campaign. And at the same time, we have fears that immigrants in Hartford, and Jewish immigrants, particularly the East Side, would be associated with tenement buildings and so forth that would seem to be as something that would lower standards or lower property values if there was to come to West Hartford. The Goldberg very much was moving into the grocery business because many Jews like Goldberg could not get jobs in many other sectors of the economy in Hartford at the time. If you were in the insurance area, the Hartford, Aetna, and Travelers, they only hired a few Jews, but often just to work as maybe bookkeeper positions. Even up until 1967, only 1% of employees of the largest insurance companies were Jewish, despite the larger population. If we look at the Hartford Hospital, the Protestant-run Hartford Hospital, or the Catholic-run St. Francis Hospital, they barred nearly all Jewish doctors with some rare exceptions until World War II. If we look at Vandriff law firms, some of which are still around today, Robinson and Cole, Day, Berry, and Howard, Shipman and Goodwin, they all refused to hire employed Jews as attorneys up through the 1950s. And these gentlemen's agreements that they're often described were often spoken and never written down, which made it hard to move against them. But at my institution, Trinity College, we even have evidence of this being written down occasionally in boardroom meeting minutes that were never supposed to become public until the archivist at Trinity College decided a few years ago to make them public. From 1915 and moving into the 1920s, President Reverend Flavel Luther was also a state legislator at the time. He said in closed-door meetings, right here in his report to the Board of Trustees at Trinity College, quote, "I think it proper to mention to the trustees in this formal way of the problem presented by the slow but unmistakable increase of the number of Jews at the college. Their presence is resented by other students and has occasioned many protests from alumni. There are not as many of them in the college as some people seem to think, but there are enough to constitute a pretty definite problem. And if they increase, the matter may easily become more serious." And it goes on and explains Trinity College's strategy to keep the number of Jewish students down, and those that they did enroll to try to Americanize them to what they wanted Trinity students to become, rather than the immigrant students who they arrived as. Now, does this show anything directly about the mindset of West Hartford's town council members or the building inspector who refused a permit to Jacob Goldberg? No, it's not direct evidence at all. But we certainly know that this anti-Jewish and anti-immigrant sentiment was felt by many. In fact, Rabbi Abraham Feldman, who was moving in the rabbi just after this period in Beth Israel Synagogue on Farmington Avenue, in an oral history interviews looking back at the time, said West Hartford was a closed community politically. Most Republican town in the United States. In his view at the time, there was no chance for a young Jew or a Jewish lawyer who wanted to be in the political life of the community. In fact, they didn't want any Catholics either, he says, referring to his views of the Protestant dominant view of the town at the time. So what happens with the Goldberg case? Jacob Goldberg fights back. He gets an attorney, it's his brother-in-law, and others, and they say, we're going to take the town of West Hartford to court. In fact, we can show that we followed all the rules, and you still aren't going to give us a building permit. The town council meets in secret, quietly agrees to give them a building permit. More town residents come out and speak against it. The kerfuffle continues. Finally, the town's own lawyers say, there's no way you can win this case in court because we've made an arbitrary decision to not give them a building permit. So they agree to give him a building permit. Kingswood Market becomes, as it does today. Yet, what happens? The town council members of West Hartford immediately put into plan something they call zoning, a new idea at the time. And the person to remember on this one here is Josiah Woods, a long-term West Hartford town council member, Amherst graduate, young business-oriented professional, and the first chair of the zoning committee 100 years ago in West Hartford. Josiah Woods is trying to get the state legislature to give local towns like Connecticut permission to do zoning. Now, what did this really mean at the time? People actually aren't really sure what the idea was. There's a concept from New York that's been done earlier, but very much it's sort of like, we could make land use decisions, the town councilors finally get permission for the state to do, and we could make decisions about what kind of businesses happen there. But the lawyers are very careful to tell Josiah Woods, you can't make arbitrary decisions. You can't make decisions about we want your business but not yours, or your house and not yours. You have to make sets of rules deciding in sort of a uniform way what types of buildings could be created in different places. And the struggle shifts more from a store more to who can live in West Hartford. It's a building boom at the time in the 1920s. There's lots of fears among current residents that their neighborhoods are dramatically changing. So a lot of concern comes about how people are going to make decisions about what types of housing could be made and so forth. And Josiah Woods brings in guest experts. Remember the name Robert Whitten? I don't have a photo of him, but he's a respected urban planner from Cleveland. He's worked in many different parts of the country, and he's brought in to be an advisor to West Hartford to help plan the very first zoning proposal, which the state gives permission for West Hartford to implement zoning, and this is the plan of how to do it. Whitten's ideas, and this is an image from one of his Cleveland plans, was uniformity of residential housing as desired. What do you want it to look like? The one on the left, says Whitten, where all of the single-family homes are all together. What you don't want is a mixture, like the pictures on the right or in the middle, where you have apartment buildings and stores and other things mixed together, which we today might call mixed-use development, actually desirable. But that's not what you would want, say the consultants at the time. And in fact, Whitten, that consultant, while he was consulting West Hartford the prior year, he was consulting in Atlanta, Georgia. He was actually designing for them a racially segregated zoning plan. Even the U.S. Supreme Court said you could not zone by race, but he was helping Atlanta city officials draw it out, how they could actually have neighborhoods that would be restricted by racial designations at the time. So what does Whitten do in West Hartford? His zoning report, you can read the link and see the document online there. It has a soft rhetoric of inclusion with very hard rules of exclusion mixed together. There's a lot of language about orderliness and bringing chaos into uniformity for a town that's growing like West Hartford, and also trying to provide for all different types of people. But what really drives things, I can communicate to you in this type of picture here. Whitten recommends rules for West Hartford that become the basis of zoning that essentially say, what you're going to do is you're going to restrict in different areas of town how much land is required to build a residence for one family. I'm talking exterior square footage here. We aren't talking in the interior of the home. This is like how much land has to be there, the parcel of land, to be able to build on that spot. And the A level of zoning would require 9,000 square feet of land for a one-family home. And that's just kind of a scale diagram there. Obviously, there's going to have more land costs involved. And there are other places that would be triples or apartments that would require less land per family to be housed there. The challenge in all of this, the dynamic in all of this was that Whitten knew it very clearly that he even wrote it out. While 3-family houses and apartment houses are not prohibited in the zones A and B and C, it would become uneconomic to build them there. In other words, the rules were set up so that you couldn't make money unless you were building single-family homes in most neighborhoods. And if we looked at that map of what the 1924 map of zoning looks like, this is the 1924 map. You could sort of see roughly here, there's different, I'll just show the bottom part, there's different green levels. The darkest green is that level A, it's the most exclusionary zoning there is, and that's most of the town that had not yet been built out in the 1920s. The B level, requiring 6,000 square feet of land, is a larger chunk of town as well. There were areas of town, often West Hartford Center or the strip of Farmington Avenue, where apartment buildings had already been built, that they would allow apartments to be built. Zoning grandfathered in existing buildings. Zoning was always forward-looking about who will be allowed to build in different places. So most of the land in West Hartford was assigned to be the more exclusionary zoning areas. And in fact, West Hartford in 1927 went even further, and the town council adopted not just the zoning plan, but the town council actually prohibited any apartment buildings from being built in West Hartford, because apartment buildings were seen by Whitten and others as a symbol of urban influences that West Hartford residents shouldn't want to have, even if they were. These are from his report. I don't know if he knew he was taking pictures of what was considered to be on the radar luxury apartment buildings at the time, Packard, but this is what single-family home residents shouldn't want these anywhere near them in Whitten's view of the world. So I will jump on to, so there's debates in West Hartford about what zoning should look like. There's some minor changes that are made, but essentially that logic of let's restrict how much, let's require a minimum of land required to build a home for a single family. Let's build that in. That lays out a sort of a template on top of West Hartford that lasts from the 1920s, when it's first implemented, through the 30s, 40s, the big building boom of the 40s and 50s, up through the 1960s. And people today say West Hartford is essentially built out. In other words, most of the land, not all, but most of the land that you could build on has been built. And this is a sort of an interactive map that shows that. In other words, the blue shows buildings that were built in that decade. Here's the 1900s, the 1910s. Remember I said the 1920s was a big housing boom in West Hartford? You can see that boom happening right there in the east area and West Hartford Center. And then during the Depression, there's some building But here's another big boom, the 50s and 60s. And remember, this is an online map. You can look at this and you can actually go find out and you say, oh, I wonder, if my house is here, the land here, you can actually see on each property what's the date it was built according to the sort of the town property assessor records. Might be off if the building was substantially rebuilt or so forth. But I think I'm trying to get across here that the framework of zoning that was laid out and those rules about how much land you have to build a residence for one family set in motion what building would look like by and large in most of West Hartford. And if you just want to briefly think about what happens across the state of Connecticut, what happens here in West Hartford and other towns, Fairfield was another early adopter of zoning as well, and a few others, it takes off. In fact, here's the state of Connecticut. Here's an employee at the state just trying to update the maps. Here's his 1938 map of all the towns that had a zoning board. And he's trying to update it for the 1944 map. You can see the difference between the 1938 up here and the 1944 down here. Zoning is taking off, and by 1957, most towns have some type of zoning board. Notice many of those zoning boards are popping up wherever there was an urban center around them, because people are trying to control what people are building and who's going to move in around them. I think the other takeaway from this is that when we look over time what's happening by 1950s, we actually have towns competing with one another to create more exclusionary zoning to attract higher income families to buy homes in their towns. West Hartford ups its most exclusive zoning area in the 1950s. Remember, it was 9,000 square feet for one family. That's not that big. But by 1950s, it's bumped to 18,000. In fact, that R18 is what's showing that there. That's the most exclusive areas in West Hartford in 1950s. Bloomfield, also trying to catch up and get in the act as well, comes up with different zoning areas for different parts of town. But here's some R30s and R40s, and that's 30,000 square feet of land or 40,000 square feet of land per family. Avon divides its town into Webster as an east zone, and that east zone hits the 87,000 square feet of land for a one-family residence. Why that number? It's 2 acres. That's a quick way of explaining how we got to where we are today. I'm said happy zone-iversary, and some of you chuckled as well, but I think we need to think about how our past got us to the present. It doesn't mean that we're directly responsible for these things. This is decisions that were made by local leaders or state officials or federal leaders in the 1920s. We weren't here making those decisions then. But we certainly, those of us who are in this system, often benefit from a system that set up residential areas to keep out lower income people. And we also have to make thoughtful decisions about what we're going to do with our future. We can't continue to repeat mistakes from the past. I'm going to hand that over to Victoria, who's going to talk more about the present day. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. You're a tough speaker to follow. All right, yep, and just as Jack said, we're going to look at some of the present-day zoning in West Hartford. So right here we have a current land use map of the town. You can see most of the town is that pale yellow color, and as you can see in the legend, that is single-family zoning. So even though it looks pretty colorful, there's a lot of different uses. The majority is single-family zoning. And right here we get into single-family a little bit more. 45% of the land in West Hartford is zoned for single-family residential. However, this is still less than the percent of land in the entire state which is zoned for single-family. According to Desegregate Connecticut, single-family housing is allowed as of right, so they don't need a special permit to apply to build, on more than 90% of the land in Connecticut. Only 3% of West Hartford's land is zoned for multifamily. This is significant because, based on the housing stock, 34% of the units are multifamily. So even though multifamily is only allowed on 3% of the land, it still makes up a significant portion of the current housing stock. All right, I decided to zoom in on a certain neighborhood here. This is the Mountain West neighborhood in West Hartford. Jack just mentioned a little bit about the different zones, the R80, well, there was R87 in the former slide. Here we can see there is a large area that is R80, there's some R40, and then R20. And right here, I separate out what the land use minimums or the lot size minimums are. The R80 district, you need 80,000 square feet per dwelling unit just to build a house there. And as Jack mentioned, for reference, 87,000 square feet is 2 acres, so 80,000 is a little under 2 acres, 40,000 is a little under 1 acre, and then 20,000 is about half an acre. Now let's connect this back to the population in West Hartford. So this chart shows that between 2010 and 2020, West Hartford's population slightly grew, and even though it was only about 1%, it's significant because we can see that the state as a whole and the region, Hartford County, both declined in population. Now that might be a little bit different today. I think all have slightly increased, but it's significant that even before 2020, West Hartford was growing while the region was not. West Hartford is also becoming slightly more diverse. We can see that the Latino and Asian populations, as well as other race, have increased, while the white population is declining as a percent of the whole, and the black population is staying relatively the same. If we look at where different populations are located, we can see that the Latino population is more concentrated in the southeast area of the town. This is along New Park Ave or the Elmwood neighborhood. The black population also tends to be more concentrated in the eastern area of the town, though not so much in one area as much as the Hispanic population. And how does this relate back into zoning? Well, here's that land use map from earlier. If we zoom in here, or just look, and I don't think I can zoom on the slides actually, this area right here is industrial/mixed use, whereas, as we mentioned before, most of the town is single family, and that does create barriers. As we know, it's expensive to own a home, it's expensive to buy a home. Here are some current developments going on in West Hartford. So over here, went too far ahead. Over here we have, keeps doing that, keeps clicking. I'll just gesture. In the Elmwood neighborhood, we see 3 new developments that have significant affordability. That means between 10% and 80% of the development is marked as affordable. So that means those units are designated, they're set aside to be affordable at either 80% of area median income, 50% of area median income, sometimes 30%, and sometimes as low as 20%. I'm actually going to open this map here. These blue markers are developments that have relatively few number of affordable units. So right here, this is actually one of the more significant ones. This is Heritage Park, the former UConn campus. 322 total units of housing will be added, which is great for the overall housing supply, but only 16 of those will be set aside as affordable. Now if we go over to, let's see, I think this one's a good one. This is Elmwood Lofts, 117 total units, so roughly half the size, or maybe a little less than half the size of Heritage Park. 30 of those units will be affordable, so more affordable units, even though less overall units. Let me just go back to the presentation now. And I decided to compare this side by side with the poverty rate map in West Hartford. This is actually taken from Open Communities Alliance's opportunity map, and we have a layer on there for the poverty rate. You can see also that this same neighborhood tends to be higher poverty. The Elmwood, keeps doing that. Elmwood neighborhood tends to be higher poverty. This is just significant because even though you might think that, yes, we need more affordability in areas with higher poverty, it's important that we not tend towards continuing to concentrate poverty. So affordable developments really are needed everywhere so that poverty is not concentrated. So how does West Hartford compare to the Hartford region in general? I decided to put it next to Farmington, neighboring town, just because, they're similar in a lot of ways, but also different in a lot of ways. Farmington is significantly smaller than West Hartford, with a population of 26,000. West Hartford has a population of roughly 64,000. There's also significantly less housing stock in Farmington, roughly 11,700 units in structure. That's residential units, by the way, and 27,000 residential units in structure in West Hartford. So more than double the housing stock of Farmington. Farmington does have a higher percent affordable than West Hartford. Roughly 8% of all the housing units in Farmington are affordable, while only 7.65% of units in West Hartford are. However, again, West Hartford has a lot more units, so there's actually more affordable units in West Hartford, despite it being a smaller percent of the town. And here I compared it to Fairfield, which is a town, different area of the state, but a lot more similar in terms of the population size, the amount of total residential units. Roughly the same population, 22,000 units in Fairfield, 27 in West Hartford. Now, if we look at the percent affordable in Fairfield, 3.05%. That's less than half of the affordability in West Hartford. So, generally, overall conclusions, West Hartford is generally doing better at allowing affordable housing and multifamily developments than a lot of other towns in Connecticut. However, there is still some work to be done regarding zoning restrictions. If we think back to those previous slides about single-family zoning and Jack's presentation about lot minimums, we are reminded that, single-family zoning and lot minimums can create barriers to affordability. And these are just some ideas on how you can get involved if you are interested in supporting affordable housing, or supporting desegregation in Connecticut. Just being open to housing development in your neighborhood is huge. A lot of times, we see people, they say they're for, progression, but then when a new apartment building, even if it's a relatively small apartment building of maybe, 20 or so units, a lot of times people will oppose that because they don't want it in their neighborhood. Another great way to get involved would be to support Connecticut legislation, which aims to further fair housing goals. This current legislation, or the legislative session, just ended May 8th, but there's always next session. You could also attend a local zoning meeting, and you could check out resources on our website. We have some about Connecticut zoning specifically, since we are a Connecticut organization. And that's all I have. Thank you.